I'm just going to wait 30 more seconds and then we'll kick off. So good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this lovely Tuesday morning. It is actually so lovely outside. I hope you guys can get outside today in the sunshine, or if you have been out already, I hope you've had a good morning outside. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Virgo and I am a mental health campaigner. So I work all over the world, working with schools, corporates and hospitals, and then also do a huge amount of work with the government in the UK. So looking at things around eating disorders, but also a little bit more broadly on that whole area of mental health, getting people to talk about things, but also making sure that people have the skills that they need to feel equipped to kind of support those around them, but also to manage their own well-being. So this morning, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my personal experience of living in recovery from an eating disorder. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the ways that I manage my well-being on a more kind of broad basis, and then looking at a bit more of a focused time on actually what we're doing now and what we can do now to really support ourselves during this time of turmoil and this time of uncertainty. Just a few things just to flag before I start talking properly. So the way that I share my story is very honest. The content shouldn't be triggering to anyone, but if there is anything that I say that bothers you, do feel free to leave the chat if that's best for you, to leave the webinar even if that's best for you, or there will be time afterwards to kind of ask any questions around the things that have come up. And I will also leave my email address at the end, so if you do have anything that you don't feel able to ask in front of everyone else, you can also email me afterwards. The other thing to flag is there is a chat function on Zoom. I'm sure a lot of you will know that as well. So if you do have questions throughout, do feel free to pop it in the chat box. And like I said at the end, we can then come back to all of those questions as well. So my story began on the 8th of May in 1990. I grew up in Bristol. I was one of 5 children. I didn't have a particularly challenging upbringing. Everyone kind of got along and functioned and seemed fairly together most of the time. When I was 9, I had my first lot of therapy. For some reason, I found it really, really difficult to express any sort of emotion. Whether it was happiness, whether it was sadness, there was something in my brain that didn't quite click. And my mum thought the only solution to all of this was to send me for 1 hour of therapy every single Thursday lunchtime. So I'd leave school and go and see this lady. We'd do little bits of artwork. She'd get me to write bad habits on a piece of paper and put them into a tissue box. And every single week I would sit there and think, what should and shouldn't I be saying? What's the right and wrong answer? What would all my friends be doing in this situation? After 6 months of that therapy, nothing had changed for me in the slightest. I didn't really fully understand why I had to have the therapy, and I thought the whole thing was a little bit of a waste of time. I went back to school and kind of continued through the rest of junior school, living my life the way that I knew how. I was quite happy at this point, so I didn't really think it was that much of an issue that I struggled so much to engage with my emotions and my feelings. When I got to secondary school, things got a little bit harder for me. My older brother, who is now a wonderful person, back when I was growing up, he was really angry a lot of the time. He ran away from home an awful lot. He often ended up in A&E after fighting with my dad. And being that middle child, I made it my responsibility to try and fix this entire family dynamic, to try and protect my younger sister Molly from every single thing that was going on. I'd go and find James when he ran away from home, or sit with him for hours in A&E, trying to calm him down, just so that when we finally got home, we would just have a little bit of peace and quiet. Around that time as well, I was also sexually abused for around 8-9 months. And throughout that whole period of time, I didn't talk to anyone about it. I felt really guilty and really ashamed about it. When it finished, the man went off, got married, and I thought because he'd moved on with his life that actually I had to find a way to move on with my life. I had to find a way to deal with all of those emotions going on inside me, to deal with all of those distressing images that I'd be left with. But because I didn't want to talk about it to anyone, because I didn't really know how to talk about it to anyone, I had to find my own ways to cope with it. And that was when I started to hear this voice in my head. And that voice was the anorexia. And it was like having this best friend with me the entire time. It gave me this real value and sense of purpose every single day, controlling me from the moment I got up in the morning to the moment that I went to bed in the evening. Every time I did what it told me to do, it just praised me. It made me feel incredible about life. As well as that, it took away all of those emotions, all of those things that I just did not want to feel anymore. And I absolutely loved it. I felt like I'd found this magical solution to life, this magical solution to all of this pain and sadness. And I was winning at life because I had it. I hid this from everyone around me for the next 4 years. There were times when that voice in my head was slightly frustrating throughout that 4-year period, but most of the time I still really, really loved it. I didn't tell anyone about it, mainly for 2 reasons. The first was I was slightly embarrassed that I had this voice in my head, and I thought maybe it was a little bit weird. The second was because I was afraid that someone would take it away from me, that someone would take it for themselves, and then I'd be left with absolutely nothing. Towards the end of that 4-year period, that voice in my head was getting louder and louder, but not in a good way this time. In fact, it was getting louder and louder. And every single day I did what it told me to do, but it wasn't ever good enough for it. Every single day it pushed me further and further and further, and I couldn't quite live up to those expectations and those standards that it was setting. After my GCSEs, I went away with my school friends. And we had this week of eating and drinking and going out. And I couldn't get my head around the fact that everybody else was totally okay to eat what they wanted to and drink what they wanted to. Because now, whenever I had anything like that, that voice would make me feel like a complete and utter failure. It would make me feel so, so guilty. After that week away, I didn't really want to see my school friends again that summer. When I was with them, I was in this conflict zone. It was either them being happy with me getting involved and eating and drinking, or it was me feeling happy by not eating anything. And it put me, like I said, in this conflict and in this constant battle in my head. And I was having to weigh up whether I wanted to feel really guilty or whether I should just shut myself off from everyone around me. That same summer holidays, I went to the dentist with my mum, and the dentist pointed out that all of my back teeth had started to crumble. I made up my own excuses why I thought this was happening. I was very defensive, kind of shut her down pretty much straight away. I then got in the car to go home with my mum, and we had a massive argument about it. Got home, I went for a run, came back, and we never talked about it again. It wasn't my mum's fault we didn't talk about it, but actually neither of us knew how to have one of those conversations. Neither of us knew how to talk about mental health, about eating disorders, about anorexia. Neither of us really knew what it was. After that summer holidays, my whole life got completely shoved into the limelight. My school contacted my mum. I then went to my GP, and then I was finally referred to the Children's Adolescent Mental Health Services, so CAMS. Being a young person and going to CAMS is absolutely terrifying. I'm sure that some of you will have had experiences of CAMS, whether it's through yourselves or whether it's through people that you know or people that you support. But it is really, really scary being that young person and just walking up to this hospital. I remember that first appointment. It was just the strangest thing I've ever had to experience. I walked up to this massive mental health hospital with my mum next to me. We walked down this long, eerie corridor, turned right at the end and sat in the waiting room. My eyes were darting all over the walls in the waiting room. There were leaflets and posters, OCD, depression, psychosis, eating disorders, everything just kind of like slapped bang on all of these walls. A boy then walked into that waiting room. He had cuts all over his arms. And I remember just looking at him, trying to work out why he was there, trying to work out exactly what was the matter with him. And then at the same time, trying to work out why I was there, trying to convince myself that I had no right to be here, that I shouldn't actually be in this mental health hospital. Then I got called into my appointment. My mum and I walked down the corridor to another room at the end of the corridor. We walked in and there was a clinician sitting there. The clinician tried to have some kind of conversation with me, but I stared directly at the floor. Occasionally my eyes might dart around the room, looking. There were more leaflets, more things on eating disorders, more things on depression. And then on his desk, there were a couple of thank you cards. people saying thank you for what he'd done for them. And I just couldn't get my head around it. I didn't really understand why I was there at this point. He then handed me over these 2 massive questionnaires. Questions about my body image, about my relationship with food. And this questionnaire where I had to judge my mood on a scale of 1 to 10. Being someone who'd never ever had to do that before, I had absolutely no idea where to start. I ended up circling 5 on every one of those questionnaires because I felt like that was the best answer to give, because maybe then people would just think I was okay and just leave me alone. I then moved on to the other questionnaire, the questionnaire where you have to give so much more information. And I was sitting there just staring at this page, trying to work it all out again, working out what the right answer was, working out how to give that perfect answer so that people would be happy with what I'd said. I remember looking at it and various questions jumped out at me. I was working out how much I could lie or whether I was supposed to tell the truth or not. Should I tell everyone that every night I get into bed and I cry because I've had any amount of food that day? Or that every morning my alarm goes at 3 a.m. so that I can go running before my mum gets up? But as soon as you start giving all of that information away, I was so worried that people were going to start interfering. I left that appointment on that Tuesday and they told me that they needed me to come back a couple of days later. I went back on the Thursday with my mum again. We walked into that same hospital, and this time it felt a little bit more scary, a little bit more unknown. Why was I being called back so quickly? In that appointment, they diagnosed me with anorexia, but I had absolutely no idea about anything to do with this. I didn't really get it. I was like, I don't have anorexia. Firstly, I don't look like an anorexic person. And secondly, anorexics hate food and don't eat anything. And I do eat some things, and I wouldn't say I hate food. And my mind was trying to work it all out, working out exactly what they were doing. The clinician then went on to tell me all of this stuff that was happening to my body, trying so hard to scare me into getting better, so hard to scare me into eating. He told me that my hair would keep falling out, that my body would stop repairing itself, that I'd have to drop out of school, stop learning to drive, and that eventually I'd have to go to hospital. But I just did not believe anything he was saying. As soon as they said the word anorexia, I completely switched off. Everything he was saying went in one ear and out the other ear. That evening, I remember I got home and I Googled the word anorexia to try and have a little bit more of an understanding about it. And I found myself down all of these rabbit holes on the internet, like trying to work everything out, trying to work out what it was, what I could do, how I could hide it. All of this stuff, all of these chat rooms just suddenly emerged from like various people that I'd never even heard of, never even come across. And again, it then starts to kind of spur you on to do even better at doing what that voice is telling you to do. I continued at CAMS over the next 6 months as an outpatient, going every single Tuesday afternoon. Every single Tuesday, my mum would pick me up from school and we'd go straight to the hospital. Before she picked me up, I had this 15-minute window where I would get myself ready for that session. It meant that by the time I got to the hospital, I was able to trick the system. I was able to trick it so much that my weight would either stay the same or it would go up. And every single week, I absolutely nailed it. I created all of these win-win situations. I was really happy because my weight was they thought my weight was going up, so they were leaving me alone. My mum was happy because she thought my weight was going up and that everything was going to be okay. And the clinical team were happy because they thought that I was kind of doing what they told me to do. For me, it also meant that I could go into these therapy sessions every single week and pretend that I was fine, pretend like everything was constantly okay. I would sit there and just backchat the whole time, telling them I'm fine, life's fine, everything's fine. But actually the reality was I was really not okay at this point. I was really, really struggling with so much stuff that was going on in my life. I wasn't happy the majority of the time. I hated that voice in my head so much, but I didn't know what to do about it. But I didn't want to tell them again. I just wanted to keep all of this stuff to myself. 5 months into my time at CAMS, my mum picked me up from school a little bit too early. I didn't have time that week to get myself set for that session. I sat in the car next to my mum, really stressed and really anxious. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got to the hospital. And then, within 2 minutes of walking into my appointment, They weighed me and they realised that for the last 5 months, every single week I had lied. Every single week I had managed to trick them. At that appointment, they called an emergency with loads of my clinical team all coming in. I lost a lot of my independence that week. I wasn't allowed to go out with my friends. My mum contacted the school, so they were constantly on my case. She also contacted the gym, so that if I ever went to the gym would ring my mum and then she'd come and pick me up, which in itself was so, so humiliating. But instead of it helping me to realise that I needed that extra support, what it did instead was it kind of put me even more at that defence. My walls protecting me completely shut up. I was convinced that they were just trying to take away this one thing in my life that made everything okay, that everyone was jealous of me, that I found this magical thing, and I couldn't understand it. The next 4 weeks turned into constant arguments. The days were long. They were getting up and exercising obsessively, going to school for a little bit, coming home in the evening, exercising more, then family argument after family argument. And then if I didn't have the energy to argue with my mum about whether I was going to have something to eat, I'd eat my dinner really quickly, go upstairs to the bathroom, lock the door, turn on the shower, and then spend the next couple of hours making myself sick, making sure that every single thing was out of me. And it was those evenings that I just absolutely hated that voice in my head. I would sit in the shower with the water just pouring over me, sitting there just waiting and waiting for things to just stop, just to have some kind of break. Every single one of those evenings, I would tell myself that tomorrow is going to be different, that I'm just going to get up, I'm just going to start eating, and everything's going to be fine. The next morning, I'd get up, I'd look in the mirror, I'd weigh myself, and I just couldn't do it. My brain just did not let me start. And it turned into this cycle again and again and again. And then after 6 months as an outpatient, I hit that complete rock bottom, and my heart nearly stopped. And I was admitted to a mental health hospital, where I then spent the next year of my life trying to recover. So learning about food, learning about exercise, and the biggest thing of all was actually just learning to talk about how I felt. The problem for me, though, when I arrived in that hospital, which I've already touched on a little bit, is that I was still in that complete and utter denial. And this is something that comes up so much with eating disorders. We are in this denial phase a lot of the time. We don't really think that anything's the matter. We're convinced, because of that voice in our head and how it makes us feel a lot of the time, that actually what we're doing is the right thing to do. I spent the first 3 days in hospital lying in bed and being encouraged to eat. I hated it so, so much. I hated everyone in that hospital. I hated my mum because I thought it was her fault that I was in the hospital. And I thought maybe she didn't really love me because I was in this hospital. On that Friday night, one of the nurses came in to see me. She brought with her these massive pieces of paper. She got me to draw how I imagined myself on one of these pieces of paper, the kind of thing you do as a child where they mark on your head and your feet. She then got me to lie down on that exact same piece of paper, and she traced around the outside of me. She then got me to stand up and look back down at that piece of paper. And the images were just so, so different. I thought at first she'd lied to me, that she'd somehow tricked me. But I had this realization then that there was something seriously wrong with the way that I viewed myself, and that maybe I did have something the matter with me. So on that Friday night, I told myself I just had to start eating, and then at least I could get out of the hospital and do what I wanted to do. But over the next year, I gradually began to accept that I really needed that support. I gradually began to accept that I had to start talking about things and processing things in a different way. The frustrating thing with eating disorders, and particularly with anorexia, is you basically have numbed all of your emotions. And as soon as you start putting on that weight, all of these emotions come flooding back, feelings that you just haven't want to feel for so, so long. And actually for me, having to learn how to feel all of those things again felt really scary at times, but actually doing it in that safe space was just what I needed. I did so much therapy when I was in hospital. I did a little bit of family therapy, but it didn't really work with my family. I did a lot of group therapy and a lot of one-to-one therapy as well. But the therapy that really, really helped me was probably the most basic form of therapy I have ever done. After every single mealtime, every person with an eating disorder used to go into the room next door and talk about how it made us feel. I know this sounds so basic, and it is, it's so simplistic. But what it did was it helped us to remove that emotion from the food. It meant that you could eat a plate of food at the dinner table and get all of those feelings of guilt, all those feelings of failure. You'd worry that people would think that you were okay now, that everything was fine in your life. And then you'd go next door and you would have that time to actually share all of that stuff in that more healthy way. The other thing that this group did was it gave us the chance to be direct with each other. I'm sure that some of you will know that anorexia is an extremely competitive illness. You pretty much compete with everyone around you. When there are other anorexics, that competition goes up a whole other level. It's why that when you're in hospital, people with eating disorders, it can be really toxic. And actually why sometimes when you have eating disorder communities, they turn into these toxic, competitive places. And actually that's something that I have faced as well. And quite recently, actually, having people from that community come forward and compete with you on where you're at in your recovery, on what you're doing. But when you're at that point in hospital, that competition feels so hard to navigate. This group gave us the chance to be direct with each other on that, to pick up each other if maybe we'd managed to hide some of our food, or if we'd poured half our milk on the floor. All of these things that we thought was so kind of amazing things that we'd done to hide the fact we weren't wanting to eat. But actually this group, like I said, gave us the chance to keep that toxic nature inside that room and then go out into the hospital and have an okay time the rest of the time. The other thing that really helped me when I was unwell and in hospital was to think about all of those reasons for wanting to get well. So when you have anorexia, you think that you're completely invincible. You think that your life will just carry on and that somehow everything will be okay. And the scary thing is actually you can function for a very long time with an eating disorder. You can function with pretty much any mental health problem. You're probably not that happy. You might have that dull ache in your tummy a lot of the time. You might feel like your brain is quite often just ruminating over stuff. But you find your ways to cope with it. You might exercise all the time. You might work all the time. You might drink. Whatever it is, you will find your way to just keep on functioning. But at some point, you have to tackle that thing head on. And for me, it took hitting that complete and utter rock bottom to actually realize there was so much other stuff that I wanted out of life. I wanted to go traveling. I wanted to get a job. I wanted to go to uni. And the biggest thing for me is I really want to have my own family one day. And none of this stuff would be possible unless I started to really push myself and get to that better space. But the thing with eating disorders is your weight seems to shoot up, and mentally it takes so much longer for things to catch up. It means, like I said, you have to start really talking and processing things. It also means that you have to put up with the comments that people make. Comments around your weight, that you look really healthy, that you look really well now. And all of these things, they might be completely harmless, but actually when you've had an eating disorder, those words get completely twisted in your head around what they mean. And for me, a big part of my recovery was actually taking ownership of that and actually telling people that I struggled when they said things like that and having that chance to just push back a little bit. So after that year in hospital, I was discharged. I ended up going straight to uni out of hospital because I basically just wanted to have a little bit of a fresh start. I took my A-levels in hospital to make sure that this was possible. And for me, despite the fact that I was quite institutionalized when I left hospital, it actually helped me to just keep moving forward. I then set myself this goal to basically do everything that I'd wanted to do when I was in hospital. I went traveling, I ran marathons, I got a job, all of this sort of stuff that I was so set to do. My recovery is something that's ongoing. It's something that I have to manage on probably like a month by month basis. I have really, really good days with it when I don't even think about it. But I also have days when at times it is really, really challenging. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that we're weak if we find things challenging at times. It's just part of kind of life and part of what's going on. And I think for me, it's more important to actually think about what we're doing on those days that we're finding things hard and actually how we are making sure that we're supporting ourselves through that with the right support around us. I got discharged from hospital 11 years ago and I've only relapsed once in that whole 11-year period. And actually when I relapsed, I managed to kind of pull myself back through with no support from the NHS, which for me in itself was a big, big achievement. So I wanted to share a couple of things that helped me stay well, but actually things that I think we should all be thinking about when it comes to life. So the first thing is exercise. And when I talk about exercise, I mean any kind of physical activity. I don't mean running marathons every day or going to the gym all the time or working out obsessively in your room. But it's about just getting out and about in the sunshine. It's about going for a walk at lunchtime, going and sitting with your face in the sunshine, which at the moment, it feels absolutely amazing. And I'm sure that, like me, a lot of you are just feeling so grateful that we are able to actually go outside and do that sort of stuff. But it is important that when we exercise, that we're managing it, that we're not doing it for those wrong reasons. A huge part of my illness was wrapped up in obsessive exercise, and I was exercising to punish myself so that I could earn food. And actually having to change that connection between the eating disorder and the exercise has been really, really challenging at times, but actually is something now that I'm able to do. I now exercise to give me that headspace, to help me feel better about things, but to also, like I said, just give me that thinking time to just process what is going on. The second thing is knowing what our triggers are. Every single one of us has triggers in life, and it's important that we work out what these are. Whether it's things that make you feel anxious, sad, stressed about food, whatever it might be, it's important to identify these. Once you've identified them, then you can work out actually how to disjoint them from that behavior. So for me, for example, one of my big triggers is going home. I really love spending time with my family, but I find going home for long periods of time really, really challenging. I find it quite uncertain. I find it quite unsettling because my family are quite volatile. And I do sometimes feel like I kind of regress a little bit back to what I was like as a child when I was really unwell. Because I have to find a way to manage this, because I do have to go home at times. I have to work it out. But because I've identified that as a trigger, and I've identified that if I don't manage it, then I will react in an impulsive and an irrational way, I now have to work out what I can do next. So what I do is, I always ring my mum before I go home. We have a quick phone call. We talk about what food's going to be there. We talk about who from the family is going to be there. We talk about rough timings for things. And yes, it sometimes feels ridiculous that I'm now 30 and I have to have that conversation. But actually the fact is the more we talk about things and the more we build up our coping mechanisms around those triggers, it means that next time we do it, it feels so much easier. The next thing is around challenging myself. So about 2.5, 3 years ago, I realized that I was like this functioning anorexic person. I was in a pretty good place in my recovery and pretty happy, but I still did manage my eating quite rigidly. I had the same thing pretty much every single week. I went to the same restaurants pretty much every week, and I basically drank the same amount of alcohol and the same amount of exercise. And whilst the fact, like I said, felt like I was in this good place, I realized that actually that part of my brain was still there and still trying to dominate. So what I did was I made a commitment to challenge myself every single day with food. And for me, that's things like I might go and get a packet of crisps at lunchtime that I might not normally get, or I'll go to restaurants that I don't know what's on the menu, or I'll order a takeaway that I might find a little bit more challenging one day. And yes, sometimes it feels hard to do this, but the more we push ourselves and push those boundaries, the better it is for our recovery. For me, if I don't do that, the anorexia will slowly try to kind of take hold again. It will try and suck me back in, particularly when life feels really difficult. And the more it does that, the more inwardly I look at my life. So I have to be so conscious of constantly pushing it out. I also make sure that meal times are enjoyable. So just making sure actually they're level places to be. I'm mindful of what I look at on social media, and actually I'm mindful of how stuff makes me feel when I'm looking at it. I'm not here to kind of dictate what we should and shouldn't be looking at on social media, but I think it's important for everyone to take ownership of that, to be aware of the times of day that actually you might be struggling a little bit more on social media, or the times of day where maybe you've had a rough day and you're just kind of mindlessly scrolling. I know that I do that quite a bit actually, and subconsciously it does make you feel so much worse because you're constantly comparing and flooding yourselves with these images. So just taking that kind of approach to just be mindful and making sure that you're looking at the right stuff really, really helps. And the final two things come hand in hand together. So the first thing is therapy. So I do still have therapy. I went back to therapy this time last year. The reason I went back to therapy wasn't because my eating was getting funny again, but I've spent kind of 2 years prior to that going through a court case around the sexual abuse that happened to me as a child. And doing that, I found it really challenging. I found it hard kind of unearthing all of these memories and kind of like unboxing stuff again. At the time, I didn't realize the impact it was having on me. I worked pretty much 24/7 as my coping mechanism, trying to fix every single person around me. But actually, when the school holidays came and things got a little bit quieter, I actually began to realize that something wasn't feeling quite right. The therapy that I now do is called person-centered therapy. So it's a type of therapy that I have never done before, but it gives me that space to actually talk through all of that trauma that happened to me as a child, and actually just take a bit more of that power back myself, and to get rid of a lot of that shame that I still carry around it. I used to think it was really bad that I was going back to therapy. I felt a bit embarrassed about it. I also thought people might think I didn't have any friends, because surely if you've got friends, you don't have to do therapy. But that's not true. So many people need therapy, and actually I think a lot of us could probably benefit from it. So I do just encourage you, like, if you're struggling at the moment, or if you've been struggling in the past, actually having therapy is okay. And for me, it has massively helped me push myself further into that recovery space. And the final thing is just talking about how I feel. And honestly, this is something that I do still find quite hard at times. I find it so easy to broadcast my entire life on social media, or to, I don't know, to talk openly about what I've been through, or to be so vocal on the telly about things that really bother me, things that upset me, and anything government related. But I do still find it challenging at times to actually talk about what I'm going through and what I'm feeling on that day-to-day basis. But all of us need to have those people around us. All of those